All right, this is the Committee of the Whole. This is March 20th, 2017. I have Councilor Capone.
Here.
Councilor Della Sola.
Here.
I have Councilor DeFlorio. I have Councilor Halen.
Here.
I have Councilor McLaughlin.
Here.
I have Councilor McKinnon.
Here.
I have Councilor Napolitano.
Here.
I have Councilor Sani.
Here.
I have Councilor Simonelli. We have 9 members present. We
Thank
do
you.
have a quorum.
Please stand and salute the flag.
Pledge allegiance.
To the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Before we start, is he going to be late?
I have no idea.
Councilman DePiero may be late due to work and/or may not attend the meeting tonight. First piece of business?
All right, the only piece of business, this is a communication from Tony Souza, Director of Community and Development, to attend this meeting to update the council on the redesign of Everett Square.
Councilwoman DeFlorio?
Could we please invite the guests up to give us a presentation?
Sure. Motion made and seconded to invite the guests up to give us a presentation. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? The ayes have it. Please come up. State your name and titles, please.
Jay Monte, I work in the planning office under Tony Souza. So tonight we have here with us some folks from UTL Design consulting firm, Tim Love, Paul Scarpecchio, and Jess Robertson. They've been working with us for the past year to develop this plan for Everett Square, which is a combination streetscape, transportation, and development plan. And today is sort of the end of this first process where we did a lot of public outreach. We did a lot of studying of the existing conditions. And this is really a conceptual plan, but one that is hopefully a jumping off point for developing this into some actual design plans that we can implement in the next few years. So they've brought here a presentation to show all of you, and I'll kind of turn it over to them.
Just state your name one more time.
My name is Tim Love. Introduce again Jessica Robertson from UTL. Jessica's a transportation planner, was the project manager for this project, and Paul Scarpecchio was a consultant on the project, former Boston City Councilor, who helped with some of our engagement and some of the public outreach that we did. So Jessica and I are going to present. Paul's going to help answer some questions too, and you have a packet of the presentation in front of you if you want to follow along or not. If you have to. So as Jay said, we've been working on this project for almost a year. There were a couple of objectives that were central to the planning study that we did. One was to see if we could create more usable open space, more pedestrian space.
I'm sorry, your mic's not on.
Yeah, that has to be green. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, should I repeat what I said, or did you hear me? Please don't, they say. Okay. So there were a couple of objectives for the project. One was to see if we could create more usable space for pedestrians in the square, while thinking about, of course, traffic issues at the same time. We think about ways that we could improve the character of the square, and that mostly had to do with some of the abutting properties, both existing storefronts and maybe potential new development that we'll talk about. I already mentioned pedestrian and vehicular circulation, get those in balance with both functioning better. We wanted to think about ways to make it easier to find your way to parking if you're going to come to the square to go to a restaurant or go to a business. And we, at the same time, wanted to see if there were a couple of potential development sites that could be more catalytic. And those sites I'll show you as well. So that's a little bit of a background of what we worked on. Then the scope of our study extended from Norwood Street, north and south, just past the old high school, going north on Broadway. going down to 16 and just past the school going down on Broadway in the other direction, and about 2 or 3 blocks off of Broadway to the east and to the west, just to think about a larger area of influence. We didn't do any concrete recommendations, and that larger area really focused on along Broadway, but we thought about traffic, and we thought about people walking to the square within that larger radius. And you can see then on the left a kind of blow up of the area in terms of what we looked at. Our primary focus was in terms of the streetscape and open space, the Norwood and Chelsea Broadway intersection, the kind of main intersection to the square, but also the way that School Street slips off of Broadway and heads on a diagonal heading south. We wanted to see, because the School Street intersection was so close to the Chelsea Street, Norwood Street intersection, if there was a better way to arrange that, maybe to capitalize on both better traffic flow, but also a better pedestrian experience, and to make a little bit more of a there at Everett Square. So one of our initial ideas and recommendations, working with Jay and Tony from the planning department, was to extend Union Avenue through and connect to School Street Place to make that more of a legible street. One advantage of that is it would allow for more traffic flow, because Norwood Street is one way coming eastbound, to get more of a traffic loop that would work better for people coming and going through the square. The one-way is currently set up a relatively fewer choices. And you'll see in a couple of slides we were able to do that without losing any aggregate parking in the square, looking at all of the recommendations that we're going to make. Our other recommendation was to extend that new street as a straight street all the way to Broadway, to get rid of the slip lane and make that a more conscious turn off of Broadway. The advantage of that is that we can make the open space, both in the square and the open space in front of the library, larger and better connect them visually. And so if I go back a slide, that's the before, that's the after. The consequence of that is that we can make the open space at the nose of the library and the open space in the square more one park landscape and more one experience, and make them seem more like one space and not two. And so our inspirations for the renovation of the park include some things that we're recommending to make maybe the grassy spaces more usable. One of our recommendations is to get them up off the sidewalk level a little bit. That makes people want to sit on the grass. When the grass is down at the sidewalk level, people are less motivated to do that. To use some of the edges of some of the lawns as seat walls that people can sit on. These are two inspirations, Lafayette Square in Cambridge and the Marriott Plaza at the Kendall T station, as the kind of side space we're talking about too. And then the idea is that short piece of School Street that either connects through to School Street Place and then the Union Ave, or then requires a left down to School Street, would be a raised intersection with paving that would match the park landscape to either side of it, so that there would be, with bollards, a little bit more of a European feel there, where those streets connected, so that it would be a more continuous landscape from Everett Square south to the library. And so this is another kind of inspiration photograph of what that can look like. The consequences of that are this rendering. You'll see in a few minutes that what this sets up is a new development site at the corner of, I'll point with my pointer, at the corner of the new School Street Place, Union Street extension, and the way the landscape is designed to cross from in front of the library over to Everett Square. The design then includes 3 triangular grass panels that conclude with 3 steps that you can sit on facing this new treatment of the road here, seat walls on either side where people can sit, and then to allow for a handicapped access to the lawns. The skinny end of those triangles are grass ramps so you can get up onto those lawn panels, and they're a nice size for people to sit on and when the weather is nice. Then down towards the library, we have a seating area that includes movable park chairs with the library as a backdrop. That's down on this end. This is an image of, this shows some of the features with labels. There's a plaza space at the corner of Norwood and Broadway where a cafe could spill out, where tables and umbrellas could be, 2 lawn panels north of School Street, a lawn panel to the south, and we're proposing a quieter location for the memorial and fountain as part of the kind of garden space where the park chairs would be. This is then, that's that piece. And then if I remove the trees, it'll give you a better view of the kind of ground plane landscape features. So this is the same view, just with the trees removed, so you can see some of the features under the trees. Looking in the other direction, this is hovering over the intersection of Broadway, looking west on Norwood. We'll talk about some proposed adjustments to Norwood in a minute, but you'll see the plaza space at the corner of Norwood and Broadway. Here, if you can see my cursor, the first lawn panel with 3 steps up to it with somebody sitting on it, second lawn panel, and then the library in the distance. This is the same view with the trees removed to give you a sense of that landscape. Again, the idea is to make that open space from Norwood and Broadway all the way to the facade of the library read more as a single open space, really a kind of a central open space of Everett Square, and to make that the square. So Jessica's now going to talk about some thinking we did about Norwood Street as part of the same concept.
Thanks, Tim. So again, my name is Jessica Robertson. I also work at UTL, and so one of the major things we're focusing on with this study is Norwood Street and how to really make that a more vibrant place to be. And one of the things that we were considering is, should the traffic, currently it's one way, sort of eastbound, and so we were looking at whether or not we should change the direction but keep it one way, or perhaps make it 2-way in order to get a different pool of people exposed to those businesses. So we looked at a number of different options, including both the traffic direction and expanding the sidewalk as variables. So in most of these options, we removed a number of parking spaces on the north side of the street to either widen the sidewalk significantly, or in the case of option 3, to make the street 2-way. What we found in terms of the traffic comparison was that while keeping it one way in either direction had, potential positive benefits for enhancing the character if we combine that with widening the sidewalk. The other benefits weren't really there for reversing the direction but keeping it one way. And if we were to reverse the direction, it would require a lot of other reversals on other streets, so that would be potentially really complex. In terms of the 2-way option, it would definitely increase the exposure to some of those businesses, and it would potentially simplify the parking by and the general circulation by having more options for which direction people can go. However, we were concerned that because there are very few ways to get across Everett, as you can see in this image, most of the streets bump up against a one-way or aren't exactly aligned, so you would have to make a right on Broadway and then a left on another street. So we were concerned that if we made Chelsea Street and Norwood Street continuous in both directions, that it would actually induce a lot of cut-through traffic, and so you would get Norwood Street overwhelmed with traffic, and it wouldn't necessarily be the people we were hoping to attract who are coming to stop in Everett Square. It would just be people trying to get across town. So for all of those reasons, we recommended that we keep it one way in the current direction, but that we expand the sidewalk on the north side of the street. This would allow us to have space for sidewalk cafes, for trees and better lighting, and also it would only remove 9 parking spaces, which we talk about in this particular diagram. If you can see, hopefully you can see a little better on your printouts. We've combined all of these moves on Norwood Street with reconfigurations of the off-street lots that can make them a little bit more efficient, so that we end up only 2 spaces down for the entire square. So we think that the placemaking benefit of widening Norwood Street is really important, and that can really improve both the character of the square and the vitality of those businesses. And we think that by increasing access to the existing parking elsewhere in the square, that we can make up for losing that small number of spaces. So in addition to reorganizing the way the parking spaces are striped in the off-street lots, we're also making a couple other important changes here that will increase access to parking. So right now, the Corey Street entrance, that side of the parking lot is not very well used during the day. It's usually pretty empty. And part of the reason is that is an exit only onto Corey Street. So by flipping the direction of those spaces and making it an entry from Corey Street, we think a lot more people are actually going to park in that section. So we'll have a higher utilization of the spaces that we already have. Also, that can help potentially with the traffic on Norwood Street if we're peeling people off sooner. So we're proposing that this be combined with better parking wayfinding, so that if you're coming north on Broadway and your ultimate destination is somewhere in Everett Square, you'll see a sign that says parking this way when you get to the fire station that will tell you take a left here to get into the parking lot, and you won't actually go all the way through the middle of the square. Same thing with the Union Ave extension that Tim mentioned earlier. Right now, Union Ave comes out on Norwood Street past where the parking entrance is, so you can't actually get into that parking lot if you're coming down from Union Ave. So with our proposed realignment, you can go straight through. So anyone coming from the north would also be able to get into that parking lot. Finally, the Union Ave School Street, New Street that we're proposing is 2-way. That's how it's shown here, and there's room to make it 2-way so that you could enter from both directions and access the parking that way. Before we started our study, MAPC, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, did a parking study, and they found, I think we showed this slide to you all a few months ago when we were here, but that overall Everett Square is below capacity for parking. So there might be particular areas, like a certain block, where it feels like it's always full, but overall, both the on-street parking and the off-street parking have available capacity. So 85% occupancy is a typical target. That means that it's well used, but you can still find a space. And so we're below that for both on-street and off-street parking. So it's really a matter of using parking management and new parking technology and some of these access improvements that we're talking about to make sure that we're utilizing the existing spaces more evenly, rather than necessarily looking for more parking. And then Tim's going to come back and talk about the development.
Yeah, I want to reiterate that the off-street parking lot layouts we're proposing and their access points is going to make the distribution of parking in them more even on both sides of those lots to help with the perception of available parking spaces. And we think with good signs, catching people coming from the north up Broadway or coming down Broadway from the north, traveling south into those parking lots will help with the perception that there's parking available in the square. I also wanted to comment too that we're proposing wider sidewalks on both sides of Norwood Street, 2 feet wider from 9 feet to 11 feet on the south side of Norwood, and quite a bit wider on the north side of Wider. We favored the sunny side of the street because those sides of the street tend to work better for outdoor cafes in general. So that was the logic for that.
Sir, come up to the mic, please.
Yeah, Paul, why don't you make
Thank you.
some comments?
If I could, then I'll sit down. So Paul Scapicchio, I helped with some of the outreach. The thought that we had, and one of the things that we wanted to do, was to make sure that this wasn't just an exercise in, a scholarly exercise, but it was something that people who lived here understood, appreciated, gave input on. So we did a bunch of things to get some input before the study, went into the phase of drawing it out. So we did a teletown hall with the mayor where he kind of made a call out to, I think it was 4,000 people we called out to have them sort of think about what we were trying to do in the square and participate. And we also tried to tap into a few different groups. New people to Everett, some of the new immigrant groups, and then the traditional folks who have been here forever. So we did, on Election Day in November, we went out to all the polls on Election Day, and we went to some of the churches as well on Sunday. So we went to catch some of the Spanish-speaking churches, people that spoke Portuguese, some of the traditional folks. And then we did a teletown hall where we called, as many traditional voters as we possibly could to try to get some input before we put this together. So some of the things that I think Tim has talked about and is going to talk about sort of people wanting to be able to come down the square and maybe buy more than just a couple of things, maybe have some other options, have some wider sidewalks and some cafes, are things that we actually got from people in Everett that filled out some surveys and talked to us on the phone. So a lot of these things are sort of backed up by some really interesting processes that we did, and we can talk about it more, but it was to sort of give you, I think, as the elected officials, some sense that it was what people actually were talking about.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that clarification is good. We covered that a little bit the last time we saw you, but I think it's important to reinforce that a lot of these recommendations came out of that engagement campaign that was earlier in the process. And I will transition to the next piece here by saying that part of the logic of this plan that you see here is to make those two parking lots much more clearly the visitor parking for the larger choice to go to the square to park once and do a couple of things, rather than just parking to do one errand and then moving your car again. That's a little bit the logic of it. And that feeds into the development concepts we're going to show you. First, one of the things that we wanted to address with the plan, and this next piece is a slightly later phase, slightly bolder thinking, I'll say. Everything that we've showed you to date is with the city's ownership and right-of-way, and could be phased capital projects, both the park and some of the streetscape improvements, again, because they're in the public right-of-way. What we're going to show you next are some development concepts on private property, but we wanted to test the concepts to understand what the development capacity was, but also see if some redevelopment might also improve the character and visual quality of the square. And so this first slide shows you this idea that there's some gaps in the square. One large gap is the parking lot in front of the Rite Aid, which is much more suburban in feel. It's very convenient. We know that the Rite Aid is an important resource for people in the square and why people come to the square, but it has a different presentation than the other buildings. And then, of course, that gap between where we're doing that other kind of work to get back to the new parking lot layout. So that's where those two red stripes are. There's also potential for development along Chelsea Street coming off the square. So what we did first is look at the development site that's created with that Union Ave School Street Place extension. It's labeled, it's yellow, it's labeled with a 1 on there. That makes some, that has excellent frontage for the expanded Everett Square. in terms of a restaurant going in there with an outdoor cafe that might spill into that space. If you just build on that little parcel that we create, you can get a building there, a small building. You can get a restaurant of about 2,800 square feet, and you can get 4 units. That would be a walk-up building. It's not big enough to get an elevator in there, but you could get 4 units, 2 units per floor. But it would do a nice job also meeting the square to create more activity along it. So we thought that was a nice idea. If you started to imagine that being a larger development site, maybe including the one-story restaurant next door, which makes it the size of a development site that would work for an elevator building with a corridor on upper floors with condos or apartments off of it, you get a 40-unit project, which is a nice size in terms of financing, and you get that red would be cafes or restaurants facing the square, which we like quite a bit. Again, that's the expanded square on the ground plane. And then Tony and Jay wanted us to look at what would happen if that whole corner would be redeveloped, not in terms of design, but in terms of what the capacity of that site would be. And in that case, you get a 70-unit project, just kind of laying out the floors. Those are both what we call development test fits or scenarios that are 70 feet tall, which is as tall as you can build with stick-built construction, which is the kind of scale that developers in the area are looking for now. So those are just some options.
So just to be clear, though,
Step up to the mic, please, sir.
I don't think we're trying to tell you, you should do this, you should do that, or the other thing, but it was to give options, right? We were asked to think big and come up with every option that you could kind of think about in the square that's going to make things more lively, use resources that haven't been resourced. And so we're not advocating taking anybody's property or anything like that, but you'll get a sense of what's possible overall to do if you so choose.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that's owned by the city, that little piece, right? These, of course, are owned by different people. It might even be an inspiration for private property owners about what's possible. We like the idea, again, in the image on the scenario on the left of getting as much transparent shop front with activities spilling into the square as possible. But we also like the idea of people living above those restaurants being part of the population of the square, to get some real stakeholders there, people who live there. So those are those proposals. Thinking even bigger, what if the Rite Aid could move from behind its parking lot out to the street, out to Broadway? And what if we then put the Rite Aid parking lot behind, which is more like the pattern of parking lots and buildings we're looking at on the west side of the square, the west side of Broadway. So again, that's that gap where the parking lot is. And so this is one concept we looked at, which is, what if you continued Marlborough Street from the neighborhood all the way out to Broadway? What's super nice about that, by the way, is that Marlborough Street would have a vista to the very beautiful facade of the library. So that's in alignment with the end of the library there, which might have been the original alignment. I don't know. We'll have to look at historic maps to see if that's true, which means that you would get 2 development sites on Broadway. The site labeled number 2 is the same size as the Rite Aid. And what you would do is you would put the parking in the back then, and you would have the Rite Aid entrance on the 2 ends of the building along Marlborough Street, and then the store would kind of feed into the south. You could put apartments above that, and you could also get a development site where it's labeled number 3, and create a new corner at the corner of Marlborough and Broadway that would make the square work much better east and west in terms of being able to get from the square to the neighborhoods and connect the library and all those things. That's a 3-dimensional diagram of how that might work. Retail is in red again, so the Rite Aid would be the full footprint. I'm on slide 28 if you're following along. And then you could get an apartment or condos above in an L configuration looking out over the library and looking out, the corner of it looking out over the expanded square. And, oh, Jessica wants to say something now. We're
Sorry.
a team tonight.
If you're looking at the printout, the parking numbers are a little incorrect here, so please refer to the slide. This is showing that the back, if I can just talk about the shared parking strategy a little bit. So what we're proposing here is, again, this is sort of like bold thinking for, theoretically, if this private property owner were interested in such a reconfiguration, we also encourage the city to think about consolidating all of those parking lots that are behind all those buildings. Right now, there are a number of different parking lots, one of which is city-owned, and then a few of which are dedicated for specific buildings. When parking lots are consolidated like this, you get a much more efficient layout of the spaces, and you can fit more spaces. And also, when you have a shared parking strategy overall, you can have, different businesses or different land uses that have different parking demands at different times of the day can use the same spaces. So each space is used more of the time. If you have retail and commercial people parking their cars there during the day, residential people parking their cars there overnight, they're all using the same spaces, so you get a lot more use out of the same number of square feet of asphalt. So that's what we're proposing here, and I apologize, the version I think that you have on paper is had an error in it. So that would be approximately 205 spaces combined, and so that would be something that would be potentially up to the city to do to consolidate all those parcels and make it one shared parking area.
And so, yeah, so with this concept, the way that parking is dealt with is consistent on the east and west side of Broadway. You've got the nice and pedestrian environment along Broadway. You've got Everett Square and the open space in front of the library as the kind of destination from the parking. But the parking is just behind those buildings. A lot of well-designed small towns are actually laid out that way, that you might look for parking in a parallel parking space, but you always know there's parking behind. And so it seemed like a pattern for us that would work very well. This concept on sites 2 and 3 generates 120 units total between the two. And so you see that there's some interesting opportunities for housing right in the square that we also think would be a benefit for kind of a population there in the evening. And then, of course, there's also a possibility at Site 4 for some development 2 that would have to get worked out with the parking concept we just showed you. And then, but there's also room for development off Broadway at site number 4 too. Just testing that vacant parcel, there's room for 33 units, but that parking would be part of the shared parking that we showed in the previous slide. So in conclusion, for development opportunities right in the square, we've identified these 4. Development Site 1 comes with a relayout of the parking lots along School Street Place and Union Ave, that's city-owned, and then development sites 2, 3, and 4, we think add up to a more coherent kind of streetscape, which I think is one of our goals too. We've really thought about the aesthetics of Everett Square and the way that new development can contribute to it. Last but not least, we're recommending a zoning overlay. We've been working with Jay and Tony on this, a zoning overlay that would be confined to just those parcels that we showed you and parcels just off Broadway, to change the code a little bit. It would include allowing mixed use as of right, to allow for retail on the ground floor and housing above. We'd recommend increasing the allowable height from 4 stories to 6 stories, because you can build 6 stories up to 70 feet, which is stick-built construction. And by the same token, we're recommending raising the height from 65 to 70 feet. Above 70 feet, you have to use, you're in high-rise code, which changes the equation for construction costs. So there's no reason to go above 70 feet anyway, because once you're at 71 feet, you're using steel and concrete, all kinds of code requirements come into play that don't make it very economical. We're also recommending in the overlay not to include floor area ratio, but just have the heights and the number of stories govern that. And then we're recommending lowering in this overlay the required parking for residential from 2 to 1 in any new development right in that area we're showing, not requiring any new parking for restaurants because they're going to park in our parking lots. And because there'll be limited office to take that off the table too. And then building into it a shared parking calculation as part of this overlay that we haven't worked out yet, but it's back to the story that Jessica told, that if there are shared parking lots, developers would have to enter into a discussion with the city about how those might be used. So again, this is just a draft, but what we think one of the next steps might be. So with that, Jay, does that cover the information pretty
Yeah,
well?
thank you. That was great, and I think we want to open up to questions from the councilors at this point.
Okay, I have Councilwoman DeFlorio, Councilman Hanlon, and Councilman McLaughlin. Councilwoman DeFlorio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In regards to what I have seen, what I have personally seen here today, because I represent that ward, and for the past 11 years, that was exactly what I was looking for.
Oh,
Pedestrian friendly, do something with the buildings in Everett Square. We have all that dead space that we're not collecting taxes on. We can't keep the people in business because we just we can't get to Everett Square. It's not just pedestrian friendly. My only concern is that I always thought in the scale of building parking garages, because we don't have space going this way, I feel we have space going up. But the way you brought it forward, it almost seems like you think we don't need any more parking. Right now, I find it hard to believe. That's,
I would, Jessica can help me answer, but on the west side of the square, we think with restriping, reorganization, and good signs, short term, you don't need a parking garage. The proposal with the Rite Aid we're showing on the east side of the square, we think can work with this. If there's a shared parking lot, we don't think you need a parking garage. That's going to require some work by the city to enter into some MOUs, into some agreements with those property owners to get them all to agree that sharing part of their land for a shared parking lot is good for everybody. It's important to understand that zone of parking we're showing behind that development on the east side of the square is big enough for a parking garage, but not a very efficient one. And we know from doing a lot of this work in other municipalities, it's very hard to get public parking garage financing these days because the revenue from a parking garage, the projections for revenue of a parking garage isn't high enough to get bond financing. So it's partly that we don't think you need it, but partly that it's not the 80s anymore. So getting parking garage financing through mass development and mass works is almost impossible.
well, because I'm thinking of if people are living, see, I always thought of expanding, like I said, the business areas with apartments on the top. So if you have, hypothetically, 100 people coming in, out of 100, not everybody's gonna have a car.
Right.
Let's say 70%, 70 of them have cars. What happens when their family come to visit? And now you're telling the business owner, I know if I have a parking lot, and you're telling me that the residential people upstairs can park there, what if they don't move in the morning? So there's so many questions that are gonna arrive. Maybe I'm going a little bit ahead.
No, I think it's all, I think that's gonna be especially true with the development we're showing on the east side of Broadway. And so I think if this concept has some head of steam, extending Harrison and doing that, we'll dive into that with much more detail and probably be back to you too. So conceptually, in terms of how we see the phasing rolling out, we don't think you need a garage. We think there's plenty of parking in the evening for restaurants and those people that have their friends and family over. But before this gets further than a concept, we'll certainly study that and be back to the council and do additional planning. But the good news is that you don't need a parking garage early to make this happen.
Right, I understand that, that would be in phases, but what I'm trying to say is I don't wanna leave it out. I wanna know that in the future, we know we can add it,
Yeah.
okay? Because we seem to, unfortunately, the city of Everett is very tight, and everything has been built without a plan, you know, with bits and pieces, and that's why it makes it so difficult. So it's like building a house without a plan.
Mr. Monty, on that?
I just want to add to this discussion too, we haven't mentioned it, but this plan, you know, builds on a lot of other plans that we're doing, and one of those is the transit study that we finished last year. Part of the discussion into, you know, the direction of Norwood Street and some of these other streets was actually to, in the future, accommodate an extension of the Silver Line coming from Logan Airport in the South Boston, that would be able to come into the square, loop around, and head back to Chelsea, East Boston and South Boston. So factoring that in as well, hopefully this becomes a much more transit accessible place as well, which would take some of the pressure off the parking. I mean, not to discredit anything that's been said, that we still may need more parking, but there'll be a number of factors as we get to that point, I think, that we'll consider as we head down. So just wanted to add that to the.
Thank you.
My other question is, how would you get, if you wanted Rite Aid to move, how do you get a company to move? Without financing them?
Okay, you can do that, Tim.
I think the first step is to inspire them with the possibilities of this plan. You know, it has to do with the landowner, you know, Rite Aid's a tenant, there's a series of parties involved. But the advantage of moving is there's more development value, because if you move them, you can put housing above. So it might be, there might be financial incentives for the development to happen, but we haven't engaged those property owners yet. We wanted to make sure that there was public support for the plan first before those discussions happen.
Okay, so how would you actually start this program? Where would you actually start? If you had to start this
I mean,
today,
Mr. Monty, we
where
already
would
have
you
a game
actually
plan.
start? Would you start on Norwood Street? Would you start on Broadway?
So
Mr.
I
Monti?
think, you know, in terms of the development stuff, that's pretty far off, because there's a lot to that, and obviously a lot of people and players that would have
Oh, I
to.
was hoping you were gonna start tomorrow.
Well, we'd love to, but going back to some of the earlier stuff, we're on public property, we're on city property, city streets, city sidewalks, and you know, one of the great things we did with this plan, unlike some of the other plans that we've done or other cities have done in the past, where you end up with a big book and you put it on a shelf and maybe you never see it again. But this, we're really teeing this up to develop, you know, next phase design documents to look at, say, Norwood Street or the park, the parking lot reconfigurations. So I'm already speaking with some of the folks at UTIL and some of their partners to put together that scope of work that we'll do it in phases or packages, but we'll have a cost and we'll have maybe a plan. And as the city and the council is ready to move forward with that, we'll be ready to do it. So
Yeah, the short story is the park, Norwood Street, and the two parking lots on the west side of Broadway are going to move forward first, because it's all public property.
And that will have the signage to go with it, is
Yeah.
that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, because that's very important.
But then also by doing some of those public realm improvements, and then also if the council decides to make zoning changes that permit or that, you know, encourage some of this mixed-use development, those things will all tee up the developments a little bit better. So by doing the things that are fully within the city's power, you can help kickstart some of the private property actions.
But I would also, like I said, like to see a plan A, B, and C. In other words, I want maybe get together with the Everett Chamber of Commerce, that if a business owner there decides to do something, how, you know, if they ask the question, I don't have the money, but I want to do this, or I want to do that, to get together with the Everett Chamber of Commerce to get them funding so that this can happen. So I believe that that's all going to be part of the game plan, and I would rather see it ahead of time instead of us starting something and then we don't have the answer for them. So,
There's different approaches to all these things, right? You can have one person be the
Come up to the
developer.
mic.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
there's different approaches, right? I think one of the things that you should consider is how to make sure that you get as many people participating as possible to figure out how you want to do it, right? Because you could have one developer come in and develop all those parcels. You could put them out for RFP. You could do it in a bunch of different ways. So I think it's a good opportunity to start the dialogue and start to get some feedback and some input, right? And when people see public money going in for roads and infrastructure, people at Rite Aid and otherwise will look and say, geez, this is where we want to be, and this is where we want to work with the city, because it's going to be in our business interest to do it. It's just, there are options, and I don't think we're going to lay out, do it this, and this, but we may be able to work with you to come up with a few different scenarios that you can kind of test and see which one works best for the city.
Okay, thank you.
All
Thank you
set,
for your time.
Councilwoman?
Yes, thank you.
Councilman Hanlon.
Put this on. Councilor DeFlorio made some very good points. My understanding that nothing is gonna happen. You guys aren't doing anything, right? We need developers to come in here, right, to do this? And there's no developers standing in line to come in to see this plan, are there? I just want everyone to know that this is just a plan.
Right.
And nothing is really gonna happen until we get someone to come in with some ideas on if they wanna build a building, or we allow the zoning for them to do it. So I just wanna make that clear.
Well, I would say that half what we're showing is within the city's right and ability to do it soon, funding pending. That's the Norwood Street adjustments, the expanded park, and the two parking lots on the west side of Broadway. And even the little yellow number 1 is city property. But the number 2 and 3 up here are private property, that we're hoping to encourage to happen, both with the public investment, but also by having these concepts to show the private property owners, to say, here's an idea you might consider. But yes, in terms of the development parcels, that's true.
Yeah. Speaking of that yellow spot that belongs to the city, that's the entrance of that parking lot. Where is the actual entrance and exit of that parking lot? I can only see it as being in one place. I don't really see an exit unless it's in the same spot.
Yeah, that's two-way.
It's
That's
two-way
true?
here, yeah.
Okay, so that means that all the traffic coming off of Broadway, if there's gonna be a street through there, has gotta pass through that area, pass beside that yellow thing, and turn right into the parking lot.
Well, there's also a
And
way
then they
to,
also have to come back out and turn right again onto School Street Place to get back out to Broadway.
So you can,
this is two-way, so you can go,
yeah, there's 3 entrances and 2 exits.
You're gonna make School Street Place a two-way?
Yes.
Oh, it is a two-way now,
Ma'am,
I
if you
think.
could just come up to
yeah,
the
yeah,
mic.
you point.
I think it is a
So,
two-way, yeah.
So Union Ave and School Street Place, both the ends of this new street, on Norwood and on School Street, those are both two-way. Although it's interesting, currently both of those locations have 2 curb cuts, so that means that the sidewalk is interrupted in 2 separate locations, which is not great for pedestrians. We're actually consolidating that, so there's only 1 curb cut, but it's wide enough to be two-way. So both of those,
No, that's all good, but my main question is they're coming back out onto this, what I call the pedestrian way.
Mm-hmm.
So you're gonna have, that's not just pedestrians, there's gonna be a lot of traffic in there, because I don't think you guys realize how much traffic comes through that area.
Yeah, I
That's a-
think, so.
We all campaign on that spot, you know, and we know the cars
Yeah.
that, we campaign there because the amount of cars that come through there.
Yeah,
You
I
know?
think it's a really good point, and in fact, one of the reasons that we wanted to look at changing the configuration in that area is that because right now it's sort of a smooth curve, like a slip lane on the highway, you get a lot of cars going really fast onto School Street, and so by pulling it into a right angle, you're gonna force people to make a real turn, and they'll have to slow down a lot more. And then also, what we're showing here is a raised intersection, so that it would be, the entire thing would be at sidewalk level, and the cars would have to ramp up, so that it's a really big traffic calming improvement. So even if you have traffic going through there, everyone would be going very slowly. So it would, if you're a pedestrian walking across that area, you do have to stop and look for cars, but they're going much more slowly, and they're also looking for you because they've ramped up to your level.
You don't really know all the drivers in Everett that go that much slower, so. But anyhow, also looking at Union Ave, how you're gonna extend Union Ave across into that School Street place.
Yep.
And I'm looking at the cars coming in from Corey Street. They can only enter into there, they can't exit onto Corey Street. And when they make that turn, they can't go into that parking lot coming into Norwood Street. You can either have to go up to Union Ave, get out, or go onto School Street Place and maybe take a left into that big parking lot behind the yellow block.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if you take a left on Union Ave, is that gonna be a two-way street now coming in to
You
Norwood Street?
mean north of Norwood Street? No, that we're keeping the same
No, not,
as it is.
the new one, the new part.
Yeah, the new one is two-way.
All right, so that's gonna, people coming from Corey Street to turn up there can turn into those spaces very nicely.
Mm-hmm.
But the cars coming down across that way, they can't turn into those spots at all because the lines are in the wrong direction.
Yeah, so if you're
Well,
coming from.
I'm just saying, no, I just want to point out, and I like all this idea about more
Right.
parking and more everything, but I think you gotta look a little bit more into where the cars are coming from and where they wanna
Yeah.
go afterwards, you know? Because that parking lot that's beside that, if they come down that way and go into that spot to park in that way, then they can come out, but they can't go back out onto Corey Street.
Yeah,
And the
so
only way they can go out is to School Street Place.
that's actually, that's a really good point, and one of the reasons that we think that that section of the parking lot that abuts Corey Street has such low utilization today compared to the other sections of that parking lot is that most people, today, the only way to get into any of that parking area is off of Norwood Street. And for most people, their destination is somewhere in the middle of the square. It's probably on Broadway or on Norwood. And so if you enter that parking lot from Norwood Street, you want to find a parking spot right away, or you want to keep going towards Broadway, because once you park, you're probably going towards Broadway. And so very few people come in and then turn right and go towards Corey Street. And that's why the daytime parking rate, and Jay can send you the data from the MAPC study that gets into very detailed. They did hourly observations. The daytime parking utilization in that section of the parking lot is very, very low. So there's very few people who enter from Norwood Street and want to go to that section towards Corey Street. So that's why we think if we reverse the direction there, we'll have more people who come in off of Corey Street and want to park, and they don't even have to go on Norwood Street at all. So it'll help a little bit with traffic on Norwood Street.
Okay, all right.
Jay?
I'll just add to that too. I think part of the objective here was to limit the amount of circulation people do to find a parking space. So by making some of these changes and making some efficiencies, the hope is that you'll find a spot sooner. You'll be less likely to go back out onto the street, circle around again, and look again. And that's,
You're around here, so you know kind of like what the
Yeah.
traffic is like, you know? But you come down that street and try to find a spot out here, you can't find it. You go out here, you go down Broadway, you can't find it. You go up the street, you can't find it. You go into the School Street parking lot, you can't find it. Some of us gotta park in Mansfield Street over there to get into this building.
right.
And that's not, we should have more parking, excuse my back, please. But we should have more parking in the city, and I look at that, but I don't wanna have a bottleneck either, and I don't want people
Right.
saying we can't get around, we can't do this.
Right.
Would they ever make that far? Because we're the ones that are gonna hear that.
Right.
And we're gonna get blamed for it, and I don't want to do that, you know that, so that's just what I'm talking about.
Sure.
You know, we wanna see that really thought out, I guess, you know, so, okay,
Anything else, Counselor?
not right now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Councilman McLaughlin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm really pleased to see this design tonight. I know some of my colleagues have worked on this for many years, Councilor Napolitano and DeFlorio, and bringing this to fruition, so it's nice to see tonight. I have just a couple of brief questions for you guys. Seeing all of this for the first time, it's somewhat overwhelming, but the change of flow of direction on Norwood Street, right now, unless you live in the city of Everett, you really don't know how to get to the top of Norwood Street, which would enter into the businesses of Norwood Street, whether it's the hospital or the restaurants and others. What was your reasoning for not reversing direction on Norwood Street, which would make it more business-friendly for the restaurants and so forth that are there from
Yeah.
Everett Square Point?
So we looked at two different options. One was keeping it one way and reversing it, and the other was to make it two-way. In terms of reversing it but keeping it one way, we felt that the total number of people who would be coming down that one block of Norwood Street would be roughly the same. But in order to reverse it, you would have to reverse all of the other streets around. In fact, actually, there's another slide at the back that I had just in case this question came up. And there we go. So all of these blue arrows in the map on the right are streets that would have to change direction if we changed Norwood Street. So you can see there's a lot of streets that would have to change. So that's why we felt it wasn't worth the disruption, to keep it one way but reverse the direction. And then we felt that making it two-way could potentially be actually detrimental if we end up just attracting a ton of crosstown traffic to use that as a cut-through, whereas today they might go to Route 16. And so we didn't want to do that. We didn't want to overburden the business district with people who are just driving through.
Yeah, I'm not sure that the two-way works, but right now, as I'm sure you can understand, Mass General Hospital's office, they have a patient that comes from outside the city. They have no idea how to get to Mass General by vehicle, because you have to kind of know the city to know how to loop around School Place Road and then come in through the parking lot and then take the right onto Norwood Street to get to MGH or any of those businesses on Norwood Street. So was one of my first questions. The widening of the sidewalks. There's one side of the street you're going to widen further or greater than you are the other side. Which side is on Norwood Street is northbound and southbound?
Yeah, so we're proposing that the north side of the street, which is currently where the MGH office
Okay.
is and the post office, that one get wider for a couple reasons. One is that it gets more sun. And so if you're gonna have benches and cafe tables, that's just a nicer place to sit. The other reason is that side of the street does have a number of existing businesses that we think would be, eager adopters of that extra space. So there is that bakery, cafe, and there was a couple other restaurants that would be, including one is already putting out tables and chairs, even though the sidewalk is very narrow. So we think that side of the street would get used very well. We're also adding 2 feet to the south side. Yes, so there will be more room on both sides.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's an incremental benefit to going wider because you can fit a full outdoor cafe and still get passage for people to walk. So getting to 19 feet's a very nice dimension. You can have actually some tables and even separate those tables from the sidewalk if somebody has a liquor license, let's say. So it's a good dimension to get a real cafe life. We couldn't get that same dimension on both sides, and we wanted to keep parking on one side of the street just to give it that kind of look and feel and to provide some convenience along there.
Is there room to be able to play it with it a little bit? The 11-foot side is one of the businesses that would probably use outdoor seating mostly is the A10 on the corner, right at the edge of Norwood Street, and that's the side that's on the 11-foot. So I'm wondering if there's play of trying to maybe move the numbers a little bit to give
There's
the
a little bit of wiggle
southbound
room.
side a little bit greater.
But when you
Yeah.
get to the end of Norwood at Broadway, there's a whole kind of plaza we're proposing, when you turn the
Right.
corner there. So, but that can certainly be looked at.
Just a
You can see
outside
you can see on this slide the way that the layout works is that you get with 11 feet and then a kind of equal 11-foot zone on the north side of the street. That's then the cafe zone, and so it's been laid out with some actual dimensions that make sense relative to the layout of that. But yeah, there's definitely some adjustments that can be made when we get into the more detailed drawings.
Perfect. And to Counselor, can you name any area in Boston that has seen such a dramatic change in your time as a city councilor in Boston that we could maybe visualize something like this transpire? Do you think of a location, Counselor?
Come on up to the mic, sir.
The entire, I think, inner ring of Boston is seen. I represented the North End, East Boston, and Charlestown, right? And East Boston is, those were neighborhoods that in some ways, they didn't mirror Everett, but, my family lives in Everett in the North End and East Boston, right? But those neighborhoods have changed, and you are seeing outdoor cafes, and you're seeing infill construction of both housing and businesses in those neighborhoods. Again, they're really tight, but you do see businesses even in those areas. And I guess the other place to look is Somerville, right, which is right now seeing, a real renaissance in sort of the old mall that they had, and you're seeing it in Union Square and elsewhere. So, I think the things that are driving development in East Boston and Somerville and elsewhere are gonna drive development here. You're close to downtown, you know, you've got an urban feel that is unique. It's kind of, it's authentic, right? It's not something that was created or made along the river for people that are, you know, of a certain demographic. So I think you can see what's happened elsewhere likely happening here if the ingredients that the city puts together are right as well.
I appreciate that. I'm glad that you're on board because you have seen it in your former district, and I'm glad that you're on board. My last question, and I'll end it, is do we have anywhere that we can see some of the data that came in from the Teletown Hall conference call or from the election day data that you guys gathered? Because as Councilor Hanlon said, right, whatever decisions are made, at the end of the day, they're going to fall on my colleagues here. So I'd like to see some of that data just to kind of back up any plans that we go forward with, knowing that the residents have put input into it.
Yeah,
Yeah, I have that.
Mr.
Maybe I should forward
Monte
that.
and Tony can share that.
Yeah, we can share
Yeah,
that with
all
you.
that
Great. I'd
information.
appreciate, Mr. Monte, if you could forward that to my
Absolutely.
colleagues and I so that we could look at that data as well.
Sure.
Thank you guys for coming tonight. I greatly appreciate
You know,
it.
one other thought on that is that, you know, the one thing that I remember from my time in office was that if you show somebody something and you say, this is what we want to do, the only thing they know is that's what they don't want, right? People like to have input and people like to be asked beforehand. So that's what we try to do here. And I think what we're recommending is that even as you roll this out as a concept, I think we would suggest doing some of those same things to elicit feedback and reaction to, you know, what the city is thinking about. And there's a whole slew of ways that you can do that. I think that we could kind of work with the city on whether it's another teletown hall, whether it's a poll that people could get on the phone and do, or some other canvassing that we could do. But I think it's good to get the statistics that we have, but I think as you move forward, thinking about so that they're not screaming at you saying this is a done deal and this was lined up for somebody else, but they know going in that this has been a process that has been open and transparent would be really helpful, I think.
Are you all set, Counselor? Thank you. Councilman Napolitano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, great presentation. I've been involved in trying to get Everett Square revitalized for over 25 years. I used to own a business in Everett Square. I've worked on 3 of the 4 corners in Everett Square. I've been talking for years about the business wall breaks that you've brought to our attention. The fact that why OSCO doesn't work is because we abolished an entire 2 blocks of commercial business space to be able to accommodate a Star Market, which killed everything else south of there. Same thing happened a couple of years later when we had where Sacro Plaza is right now. There was Tony Vittoria's Everett Sporting Goods was originally there. When that burned down, the building that went up in its place basically isolated the remaining businesses on School Street. They also died on the vine. So there's been no effort, no real thought. I remember myself and 15 other business owners meeting with then Mayor McCarthy about a way to revitalize Everett Square. And we were looking for this type of data to be compiled. And the only answer we got was, well, you all need to sell widgets. You don't tell business owners to change their product lines if they want to stay in business. You know, you try to work within that. So I'm very encouraged by what I see. I proposed 6 years ago that the second store spaces be looked at for residential development. People couldn't seem to grasp the concept of dual usage. Commercial taxes on the commercial spaces, residential taxes on the top spot. I worked as a banker in Revere, and that's all we worked when we sold our loans with those types of businesses. Why that concept couldn't seem to catch on here in Everett just blew my mind. But you're hitting these areas. And the thing is, as you started to do your presentation, one of my concerns was, I see a few spaces here lost, I see a few more spaces here lost. We can't really afford to lose a whole lot of parking spaces. But then you rolled off your presentation for behind, by moving off Rite Aid, behind Bank of America. Correct me if I'm wrong, that's exactly the same concept that Melrose has used to capitalize on their parking. I've been saying that for 10 years to deaf ears. So I'm very excited about this program because the only way this is going to work is that in some cases people need to move out of their comfort zones. The plan you're talking about, when I saw a building built down at the end of on School Street, my business was on School Street when the building that was there burned down, and the mayor at that time ran to get that property and turn it into parking. Well, we can't just keep throwing parking spaces every which way, and there's no functionality. You know, taking the back of Rite Aid, you know, most people don't think about how much wasted space is behind there and along the side. Rite Aid doesn't use that space because it was designed for a supermarket, not a small store like that. Okay, so I'm very encouraged by this. I do have a number of questions, and unfortunately, I think my questions are going to be just a tad deeper in content than I think I want to do at this meeting. But so in that respect, I would like to reserve it. But I think it's a great plan. I like it. I'm glad that the administration is on board at this. I think that, you know, we need to look at the city of Everett with all the developments going on in an entirely different light. And businesses that can only afford to rent the bottom spaces and just collect and dust on second and third and fourth spaces, this needs to go. Because if we don't create a population base in the square, we're not going to attract any businesses going to be able to invest in the square to look at trying to capitalize on that population base. The populations right now in the square between Park Plaza and Sacro Plaza are just too spread out. And that type of population jumps in the car and they go to the malls. You know, with the other thing we were talking about, again, I have no issue with dropping the parking down to 1 per unit, because the intent behind building residential parking, or residential spaces rather, living spaces in the square, is that we would capitalize on the commute that comes here. We've got several different bus lines that all come into Boston, and the proposals with the Silver Line is just going to augment that. So you don't need to live in Everett Square and own a car. And I think this is where we were trying to propose and discuss all this time. So I'm really excited about this proposal. People like to tend to look at what I say sometimes and look at me as I stamp on everything. Well, this is something that we've been talking about with most of the business owners in that 15-man group I was telling you about that met. More than 3/4 of them are dead or gone. My business is gone. You know, you could only hang in there so long until you were out of business. And that's what happened to a lot of us. So I'm really encouraged by this, because you're not going to attract a major name business to the square if there's nobody coming through or no place to park or no plan. And the city of Everett has not had a plan for Everett Square for several decades. That's why we're in the position we're in right now. So I don't have a lot of questions at this point, but other than the fact that, well done, I'm impressed. I think your plans for expanding the sidewalks on Norwood Street don't affect it enough that it gives the businesses that are using the sidewalk concept enough space to make it viable without obstructing the people walking. I think it's a great idea. So I'm encouraged to hear as we continue to proceed. Obviously, something like this, if we go, we're going to be doing it in phases, right? So you're just going to take one step, and then through each success of each phase, hopefully encourage other people who maybe are now looking at the building a little different. I remember talking to a building owner 20 years ago about the vacancies he had there, and we talked about rentals. And his only response to me was, I don't want to be bothered with those kind of tenants. Well, instead, you've got 3/4 of your building vacant, and you're paying taxes for the whole thing. Where's the logic behind that? So I'm encouraged. I really wish I had some questions, but everything you've told us so far has been answering the questions I've had for years. So I'm very encouraged by what I'm seeing. Okay.
Are you all set, Counselor?
Yes, I am.
Thank you.
I apologize, I have to pick up my 14-year-old daughter from an after-school program, so I'm going to run this. Thank you all very much.
Can we have your business card, please? Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you. Councilman Capone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you to our invited guests. I agree with a lot of what my councilors have said and my colleagues, and I do like a lot of what I've seen. There's a lot to think about. We do need to do more in this community to help the business community. In order for a city to survive, you need a healthy balance between commercial and residential. And I think it's been lacking for a little while. So I'm glad to see that we're doing this. A couple of specific questions. On slide 3, you've got a larger area, the study area.
Yep.
And I know that we're primarily concerned with the square right now. What's the significance of the box? It looks like it goes as far north to the old high school and as far south to Gladstone Street, where you've got the Whittier School.
Right.
So what are the thoughts, or are there any thoughts at this point as to any expansion beyond the square?
Well, we, often study areas are defined before we know what we're going to focus on. So that was part of the original scoping document that we signed up for. I think there was also a notion of maybe thinking about, this building and the old high school and the potential for those things too. There's been a parallel study going on, I think, that you're all familiar with about potential reuse scenarios for the old high school. And so when we were scoping this originally, we were wondering out loud how far that redevelopment thinking would go. But we made a decision finally when we got ahead of steam on the streetscape and park improvements that it might be best to focus on those development sites that are right at the square to get the biggest bang for the buck. But that was really the logic for the larger scope. Is that a fair assessment, Jay?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think also, there's an area of influence that influences the smaller area, and that could just be the character of the neighborhood surrounding, the streetscape surrounding Everett Square, the traffic patterns, things like that. So, always when you take a look at a small area, you do want to take a little broader look as well, and I think that's also what this reflects.
There's also a character issue, too, that from the Whittier School to the high school is walkable. That's the walkable perception of the square, that everything beyond there is kind of a drive. And so we were very committed to the idea that you've got a real asset here, the square. Its character, its aesthetics. It is it's one of the key places in Everett where there's a there. Despite some of the losses of building over time, you still have good bones in the square. That gives it, makes it marketable, quite frankly. The whole intersection, the church, and thinking about that stretch of Broadway as a thing to design, to think about through a design lens, not just a development lens, was also part of the logic. And so investing in making the aesthetics better is really what we're after here. To get housing, to get businesses to flourish, but to make the square as attractive as possible, which will then drive investment. We're designers too, so that was also the logic of the scope of the work.
Just one other comment, that for the zoning overlay district, that we would recommend that it be more on the larger zone scale, because that is, the businesses are lining Broadway on both sides, pretty much that whole area, and so that would be the zone where you could have, successful mixed-use development with retail on the first floor and residential above, and also, the areas a little bit further out from the center of the square do have a lot more of those gaps in the street wall and properties that, might be more attractive to redevelop if the zoning were changed in those locations. So you might be able to revitalize some of those areas as well without having such a focused public investment.
Okay. Thank you. And I tend to agree with you that making Norwood a two-way or reversing the traffic would actually undermine everything you're trying to do. It would make it a cut-through, it would make it dangerous. People wouldn't be stopping to do exactly what we're trying to do. And to that extent, if there is a way to tweak the sidewalk on the opposite side so that can extend out a little bit more too, that way you could have that outdoor cafe on both sides. And I think if we squeeze the travel lane a little bit, might cause cars to slow down a little bit too. So it might be able to satisfy a couple of things.
Yeah, and I think when we fine tune that concept, there'll be some public process to make sure that we're getting the balance right. What's nice about the Union Ave, School Street Place street extension, because that's two-way, is that you could close that stretch of Norwood for festivals and still have another way for cars to get through. So we also thought about special weekend festivals and events where you could close Norwood, that first block back off of Broadway. And so that's also why we like the Union Ave extension. It allows for some flexibility for special occasions.
Great, thank you. Then slide 23 probably is the one that might be most helpful to look at it. In terms of, right now, we have a 9/11 fountain, and we have a little bit of a plaza. Is that remaining? Is that being
Yes.
relocated? Or
We've moved it slightly, so.
The slide might show where it goes.
Yeah, if you actually, the next one, so you can see it kind of in the drawing, it's probably easier to find it on your printed version.
11?
But, we have, you can see the flagpoles and the fountain and the memorial are all still there. They're just relocated a little bit further back towards the library, so it's a little bit more of a, you know, contributes to that sort of quiet, like grove of trees area, that we're proposing, and it's not sort of like right in the middle of the intersection.
Okay. And then the last comment I have, I think it's slide 28, dealing with parking. I just want to make sure I'm clear. I guess it's as flexible as you want to be creative, and with regards to the parking, are we saying 205 spaces both sides of Broadway?
Yeah, no,
Everything?
no,
Or
just,
just right
just
there?
the east side of Broadway, but
Okay.
those two things combined.
On either
Okay.
side of the extension of Harrison.
Okay,
Of
okay.
Marlboro, yeah,
And that's only if we can get everyone to do consolidated parking.
right,
And you can do that a number of ways.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't necessarily need to be a purchase. It could be tax incentives, it could be anything.
yeah, there's
So-
a number of, cities and towns in the area that have done, an MOU where it's owned by the private property owner, but the town has an easement to, you know, to have it publicly accessible and publicly usable, you know, in exchange for plowing it or whatever, so that there's, you know, some sort of agreement on paper with the property owner. But to the public, it all seems like one big public parking lot.
We're working at we're helping the Chicopee work out an agreement to get that to work with shared parking concept, because they had the same issue, lots of private parking lots, 2 cars in a parking lot of 25 only because of the business that was there. And Lee, who's the city planner there, is working on that, both the legal and the kind of operational issues.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. No other
All set,
questions.
Counselor?
Thank you.
Councilwoman Sani.
Thank you. Council DeFlorio mentioned, and also Council Hanlon, regarding parking issues. I do agree with Council DeFlorio about maybe a parking garage and looking in some of that avenue. Because if you look at Somerville, there's not enough parking over there, and it's fighting to find a space over there. So I don't want to, we do a project, and then we have a lot of vehicles coming in, and they can't find parking, and then they leave. So I think we need to think for the future and what we want to try to bring in. And we do want to bring other people from other communities to come into our community and see how we have a nice city to go to and visit the stores and maybe even try to live here. So I think a parking garage is definitely something we should look into seeing for expansion. The other thing is, you said you did phone call database in about 4,000 people. How many people actually reached out? Do we know that at all?
So, that was it's a shame Paul has left because he organized it, but, it was a teletown hall where, Tim and Paul and the mayor were on sort of like a radio talk show style call. And so an outgoing call went to 4,000 phone numbers, and about, I think about 450 people, Jay has the numbers, but,
Yeah, I think you're in the ballpark. The
Yeah, I
other thing
think
too, it wasn't just a simple call out. We did a fair amount of outreach to let people know we were doing the call.
Yeah.
We did a robocall. We did some other flyers and things around the city. So that if they wanted to, they could also call in without, if they weren't called themselves, they could then dial into the call. And so,
yeah, so about 450 people were home and picked up the phone. And then, you know, as the radio talk show kept going, it dropped off a little bit, but we did it's a cool system where you can do live polling in the call. So we had a number of people, you know, actually patch in and ask a question directly to the mayor, but then we also had an opportunity for everyone that was listening to answer like multiple choice questions. And so some of those things, some of those questions involved, you know, widening the sidewalks on Norwood Street and other things that we then, you know, turned into design concepts.
Did we get any input a lot on Corey Street from the residents over there? Do you know?
I don't think we had a specific question for Corey Street. We'll have to go back and look if anybody
Anybody called in?
called
or-
in. Yeah, I don't recall it coming up, but we can check and we,
Yeah.
yeah.
Just to clarify though, we're not actually changing anything on Corey Street, and so what it would, the change would really be that people, instead of having to go all the way to Norwood and then come back down to get to that parking lot, they would turn in sooner, and you wouldn't have anyone exiting that parking lot onto Norwood, onto Corey Street.
I just know years ago that parking lot used to be a two-way, and they made it a one-way for a reason. There was, a lot of accidents, dangerous, so
Yeah.
I used to like it as a two-way, but I know a lot of residents and other people did not like it.
Okay.
But-
Yeah, it's still a one-way, it's just the other
Right.
direction.
Right. Oh, it's gonna still, it's not gonna be a two-way.
No, it'll be one
way or the Correct, other direction.
It'll be from Corey in instead of
Okay.
the parking lot out.
Okay, so that's not gonna be a two-way, all right.
Correct,
Make
yeah.
that flow much better, choices better.
Has anyone talked about cost figuration, like on a rough estimate of certain areas at all?
Yeah, not in this phase, but Jay is working with our team to move it towards a second phase where we would get into more engineering level drawings and start talking about costs.
My plan right now is, as we go through the CIP process for the spring, to have some numbers for you guys that we can put forth and have an idea for, at least for the design phase, the next year or so. As we get through that, then hopefully another year we'll have some numbers for construction phase.
Okay. Thank you.
Councilwoman Masani, all set? Okay. Councilman Del Solo.
Thank you. Presentation with Councilor Napolitano said, it's great, we have great ideas, this is long overdue. I have a couple of questions. I'm concerned about having a two-way going through the parking lot on School Street Place here. You're gonna have double traffic that way and coming from Corey for a so you get almost three-way traffic coming into a parking lot. I just have concerns about people parking there and trying to even walk through the park. Once you park your car, you get three lanes coming at you in the parking lot in the back. I mean, if you want to
So-
comment, I
Sure,
get two or
yeah.
three other issues, but.
So what the two sections west of the Union Ave extension are both one-way little sections. So you come in from Corey Street or you come in from Norwood and Union Ave, and then you come out onto the new Union Ave School Street Place. So all of those things are one-way, and then you feed back into that new street. Same thing with the other one. If you're coming down Union Ave, you can turn in, or you can turn in right away off of School Street Place. And then all of the backing up happens within those little mini lots. So you're never sort of backing up into the traffic that's going through.
So could I go from Norwood Street? Could I go from Norwood out to Broadway through that parking lot?
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. And then I can go from Broadway to Norwood Street the same way. So you get 2 lanes of traffic going that way, plus coming from Corey.
We don't think, given the total number of parking spaces that are in those lots, that that's going to be a problem. But I think that the questions that are being raised tonight mean that we should blow up a detail of that part of the plan and put some arrows on, and at a next presentation, provide more detail. And we also acknowledge that you know more than us, because, you're residents and many of you were born and raised here. So we want to make sure we get that right. So for the next round, we'll provide a little bit more detail about how we think the movements are going to work, so that it's a little bit clearer how it's all working. We spent some time, right, Jay, with some options and tested different things. We're fairly confident about this, but we might have gotten a
Right.
couple of things wrong.
And again, too, it's a concept level design. As you develop into engineering drawings, there's a lot more detail that goes into where the curbs go, where the signage goes, how vehicles actually move through, and so a lot of these issues that you bring up will definitely be part of
Come
that,
back to you.
that
And
process.
I think it's hard to imagine because of the condition today. The Union Ave extension to Broadway would be a legitimate street with sidewalks on both sides, and there would be 2 parking lots off of either side of it. So that would really be the feeder road to these parking lots. It's different than today, where that whole piece is also part of the parking lot system. So as a pedestrian, you'll be able to get to the parking lots on either side of that new street in terms of safety, with relatively few curb cuts to get to the parking on either side. So we think from a pedestrian standpoint, it's going to be much safer than it is now. But we'll provide in the next phase more detail with arrows about getting in and out, so everybody's, at least in this group, is fully on board with how that works.
Okay. My other concern is parking, like my colleagues were saying. It's hard to believe, you guys are the experts, but it's hard to believe, traffic is bad now. And parking is almost impossible. I know we're gonna redesign the parking lots that are there, but we're talking about with the stores that are built now, the buildings that are there now, like where 810 is, and, you wanna put units up top, condo units, and restaurants down below, correct? So you're adding more people, which parking is bad enough now. And then you want to build a 70-unit with no parking garage. So this is going to be a miracle. I just don't see how we have parking that we can't even park now, just redesigning parking lots. And if Rite Aid says no, they want to keep it like it is, you're losing a lot of parking spots again. So is Rite Aid the key to this whole operation? If they,
Well, on the west side on the east side of Broadway, they are. In other words, if Rite Aid doesn't want to move in the medium future, or that landowner, then the only real development opportunity on that side of the square is that smaller development opportunity on Chelsea Street, a couple of buildings to the east of Broadway. And in that case, if that was the only thing that had happened, the parking would have to get figured out with just the nearby landowners. But on the west side of Broadway, whether the development is just the city-owned little parcel or it extends over, to the restaurant parcel, we think there's the capacity for parking. If, for example, during the day, more of the parking lots in the back are being used, toward Corey Street, XYZ. The slide that Jessica had up before says that the kind of science of transportation planning, you've got additional capacity in the square. And the additional capacity in the square, up to 85% utilization, which is what we planned for, more than covers the development on the west side of Broadway. You need that new parking lot on the east side of Broadway. You need Rite Aid to move to get all of the development we're showing on that side. So the answer is yes on the east side of Broadway, if that answers your question. So I would consider there's almost two different phases. Phase one is the public improvements. Phase two would be the things on the west side. There's one development opportunity there, really, of a couple different scale options that are on that, forget the slide number. And then the whole Rite Aid play opens up a whole opportunity that everybody, it's kind of win-win then, up and down that whole line of properties. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but.
Just to add one thing, so this slide shows the total occupancy, looking at all of the on-street parking within the study area and the two off-street lots that the city owns off of Norwood Street, and the smaller city-owned lot off of Victoria Street, sort of by the Rite Aid. And so looking at all of those spaces, even at the very peak of parking usage, it's only 75% full or a little bit less. And so the reason that it seems like parking is impossible is that the spaces that aren't being used are the ones that are sort of at the fringes and nobody wants to park there. And so that's why, or they can't find it, or the circulation is really difficult and it's just a pain to get there. So that's why some of the other recommendations that we have are really important about changing the ways to get into parking lots, making sure there's better signage. And then also Jay has been looking at, separately looking at, new parking meters and other ways of improving parking management, because you also have to think about how many of these people are, parking all day long in a 2-hour spot. And so if we're actually doing a better job of enforcement and making sure that everyone's actually paying their meter, maybe those spaces turn over faster and it's not such of a problem to find a space. So it really all has to go hand in hand as one package. But the numbers show that there is more room, we just have to use it all better.
okay, I'm just concerned, like wherever Cooperative Bank is, from there to the square on that side alone. If you have condos up top and restaurants down below, it's talking over 100 people.
Yeah.
I'm just guessing at that. Between the restaurant, the customers, and people live upstairs. Now you're talking the other side where Braze is the restaurant, and then you want to build another 70-unit building. It's just, for me to picture, I just can't picture the parking to be there. But, you know, like I said, this is only
Yeah.
step
Mr.
one
Monti?
to about
Yeah.
50 steps that are gonna be
Yeah,
happening.
and it's a multifaceted approach for parking because, you know, as Councilman Napolitano said, you know, we also have a transit hub there. We have, a lot of the improvements are to improve walking and the ability to not own a car. And there's another MAPC study that we didn't reference here, but it was in the paper a couple weeks ago looking at, in new developments, what number of spaces are being utilized. And, you know, it turned out we actually have quite a few developments that they built a lot more spaces than they needed. The more amenities you have, the more transit, the more walkability you have, the fewer people own a car. So even though you may have 100 new units, in a transit, an area that has a lot of transit access, you know, probably fewer than half those will have a car. So you work at it in different angles. You work at it in parking management, you work at it in transit access, pedestrian, you know, walkability, those types of things, and you address it as a sort of a bigger picture as well. That's what we're trying to do.
And the last question, on Broadway itself, are we gonna widen the sidewalks going up towards City Hall?
No, the sidewalks, all the curbs on Broadway stay the same.
I was looking at restaurants, they wanna put tables out
Yeah.
there too.
We're also trying to balance, obviously, we have the bus lane.
If they're wide
and-
enough.
And, you know.
You get the bus lane. and-
Exactly, so,
You'd have full real estate curb to curb up Broadway. Nothing to give there.
All right, it's a great plan, I just, you know, like all my colleagues agree, we're here for you and like to see it happen. So people listening, this isn't gonna happen next year. This is,
but we're gonna keep working, we're not stopping here.
no, exactly.
And,
I don't want no one to
you know,
think that they're gonna
we'll-
drive down Broadway at the end of the year and see machines
Yeah,
start
right.
doing all the work.
Right.
All right, thank you,
All set, Counselor?
thank you.
Councilman Hanlon?
Just two very, very
Yeah.
quick things, you know. And I see on slide number 3 in the focused area, you have identified the Immaculate Conception Church. I don't know if that was for a landmark or to say that there's a place that's gonna use parking spots or whatever
That
it
was
is.
just a landmark.
But what I want to point out is in the focused area, there are 6 or 7 other churches that you haven't you know, and we need to find parking spaces for them too. When they use our parking lots, they use the City Hall parking lot, they use the Norwood Street, but we have 6 or 7 churches in that area. And the other thing is just what Councilman De La Sola talked about, and I was gonna ask, I lost the space now, but I think you're going from 2 to 1 on residence and 1 for hotel, 1 bed, I think. And none of that's gonna be under the buildings?
It can be,
Yeah,
sure.
it
Yeah,
can
'cause
be.
that would gain a lot of spaces, you know, I mean, maybe not a lot, but I know that,
Yeah.
that one building that's in the parking lot, maybe 6 or 7 spaces, 8 spaces go under that building.
Yeah, in some of the test fits that we showed, you do have sort of the tuck under parking, when it's a deeper building, but it's nice to keep the street
Okay.
edge as retail.
Okay, just a quick
Yeah.
comment, that's all. Thank you, thank you.
All set,
Thank you.
Counselor? Okay. No other questions? Actually, I just have one from the chair, if that's okay. This is to you, Mr. Monti, as the phases completed, will there be a revised parking study as well as a revised traffic flow study as each phase continues on?
you know, I think for
The
the,
reason being why I ask is because we need assurance as well as the citizens do to do this, so.
so when you say revised parking
So,
study,
as
collecting
the
data.
phases go on, you said there was gonna be 3, maybe 4 slots that the city owned.
Mhm.
As those 3, 4 slots get done, that's phase 1, correct? So-
Yeah, phase one, so what we're doing now is we're asking UTIL and their partners to create a scope of basically the public portion of this project. We will write into that, obviously, the engineering specifications, but we will do some more detailed traffic work as well.
Because what I'm hearing is that people are concerned here about parking and traffic flow.
Sure.
So as those phases can get completed, we need like another traffic flow study, another parking study, just to see if we're, keeping up with the flow of traffic and the parking.
Yeah, we'll do that, we'll include
You
that.
can assure us of that?
I'm trying to, as to how that's defined, I think we have to,
We'll provide more detail
Yeah.
on what the plan is and the number of parking spaces and how the parking
Right.
lots work, the geometries.
yeah.
Okay. I think it's a great plan. I think it will be, be a vibrant thing for the city. As long as we can, you know, Norwood Street, we have to get both sides going. You can't just have it on one side, you have to have both sides. Because there'll be complaints from the businesses down there if you don't, so that's just another opinion. But I'm all set with it, thanks. Any other questions?
Excuse the people.
Excuse the
with
customary
customary
thanks. Thank you
thanks,
for appearing tonight,
Yeah.
ladies and gentlemen.
having us.
And make a motion to adjourn.
What are we doing with? It's a communication, actually.
Accept the communication placed on file.
Motion made in a second to place this on file, accept the communication, place on file. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? The ayes have it.
Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn, seconded, and we have adjourned.